and I really want to thank Karen for the opportunity to be here. The journey involved stopping at 5 different airports. I can tell you how not to do it next time. I want to start by thanking Dr. Mitra for what was absolutely the clearest, best talk I have ever heard from a radiologist. I do have to say, however, that unlike Dr. Mitra, who is clearly very young and looks back to the 70s as the old days, my talk, which is also going to reflect on where we've come from, is based upon personal experience. And so my challenge to you, sir, is to keep this talk so that 30 years from now, you'll remember how you looked back and thought it was all old history, and you're part of it. I had a lot of fun doing this talk, and as you can see, this is work that I've done with my good friend and colleague Jan Willem Gorter, a Netherlander whom we managed to snag away from Utrecht in the Netherlands 3 years ago to come and work with us at CanChild. And this flying child is the logo of CanChild, the Center for Childhood Disability Research, with which I'm affiliated. And the background to the notion of the F-words is that we hope that this is a way that people will remember some of these ideas. And I picked up this idea from Jan Willem 3 or 4 years ago when we were at a conference together in Oxford, and he referred to this. And when we chatted about this, he reminded me that he picked this up from a colleague of ours in Edmonton, Canada, about 11 years ago. And Jan Willem got permission from Joanna Dara to use the phrase, and I got permission from Jan Willem. So this is an old story in some ways, but we hope that it'll be useful to you. I think it's important to remember, and again, young man, to look back at where we've come from. It really is very important to know where we've come from, because if something's a new idea, the question one has to ask is, if this is new, what's the old idea? Or to what is this a reaction? Or from what is this a reaction? And our traditional views of childhood disability, we've heard this in various ways today, have been very medical. And I mean particularly doctor medical, but therapist medical as well. So I'll blame all of us, except the parents. And we have, one of the original F words was fixing. We've had a traditional view that we were going to, oh, there, look at that. My slides are here too. We were going to fix things. And I think we should fix whatever we know how to fix. I've been a pediatrician since the late 60s. And I don't think I've ever fixed anything. Now, I could have become an orthopedic surgeon. They get the chance often to fix things, but most of us don't fix. And so that's one of the myths that we have to think about. However, at the same time, there are some very important changes that are happening in the community around us. And I think we professionals are, and even parents, are prepared to take credit for some of these changes. I think that's a little bit arrogant on our part. I think what we're doing is hitching our wagon and our ideas to things that are changing around us. And what I want to do today is to talk about how we might think about some of the ways that we are considering childhood disability and child development and family well-being in relation to some of these ideas, because I believe that with these changes in thinking and these changes in language come very important, potentially very important changes in our behavior. So very briefly, I am a children's doctor, a pediatrician. I have a major interest in child and family development, and the D word is a very important part of my day-to-day thinking. I took the important part of my training at the Wolfson Center at the Institute of Child Health. I was there from 1970 to 73. Some of you were probably not even born then. I don't want a show of hands. I am both a service provider and a health services researcher, although I spend most of my time now doing health services research. And I'm going to talk about some of our experiences of research with families and provide you, I hope, with a framework on which to hang some of the ideas. So we're going to see what we can see today. I realize that we're south of Hadrian's Wall, so I can show this slide without quite as much risk of being skinned and served as haggis. And so what I want to do is to share ideas that are familiar to some of you, I suspect, but I hope will stimulate discussion among the people for whom these ideas are familiar. But I also particularly hope that there will be people who will say, wow, that's a neat way to think about things. And as I say, this is a 40-year journey for me, and one in which I have been able to look back, and I'm still looking forward as well. And what I hope will be apparent is that what I'm going to talk about and what I want us to think about applies to everybody, and not just to people with disabilities or disabled people. Those of you who listened to Alan Colbert's session this morning will have heard some of these ideas expressed a little bit. I think it's very important that we get past the idea that there are two categories of people, those who are disabled and those who are normal or well or able-bodied. It's a silly notion. Dismiss it. So I'll try not to overload you too much with what I'm going to say, but give you some concepts. How many people in this room know what the letters ICF stand for? Just a show of hands. I promise not to ask you. Hold your hand up high. Okay, 10%? That's a bit disappointing on one side and very exciting on the other, because 90% of you are going to learn something. The World Health Organization in 2001, after many years of discussion among people with disabilities and among professionals from many countries, formulated the ideas of the International Classification of Functioning, Health, and Disability, which I'll show you in a minute. And you'll see that these ideas are meant to apply to everybody and not just to be special for the kids and families that we're interested in and the adults with cerebral palsy. So the International Classification of Functioning brings together a number of ideas in a quite fascinating way. And again, I won't ask you to get to the microphone and explain them. What I'm going to do is to show you the framework, the picture, if you like, that links these ideas in ways that I think are very important. And what I won't go into in detail is where these ideas came from, because I said this is new. But in fact, in 1980, the World Health Organization published a set of concepts called the International Classification of Impairments, Disabilities, and Handicaps, and showed how a condition, in this case, in today's discussion, cerebral palsy, produces problems in body structures such as the ones that Dr. Mitra has shown us, which in turn lead to disabilities, which in turn lead to handicaps, which are the social consequences of this poor, crippled person. And that was a set of ideas, and by the way, that crippled person was in large quotations. I don't want anybody to say I use this language seriously. Those ideas had some utility from 1980 to the late 90s, but there were a lot of problems with these ideas. And so what I'm going to do is to show you the ICF framework and then to take you on a journey along the path. So this is the ICF, and what you'll see here, what you'll see here is that any health condition, and today's discussion is about cerebral palsy, in this notion, any health condition can have, not does have, can have implications at the level of body structure and function. The pictures that Dr. Mitra showed us were evidence of structural problems in the brain, structural differences in the brain. The condition may interfere with activity, which is stuff we do. So, classically with children with people with cerebral palsy. These are problems in mobility and hand function and communication, possibly in many other areas. The third area in which the health condition can have an impact is on participation. And again, Alan Culver this morning referred to this. Participation is doing stuff. It is engagement in life. And everybody here today is participating. You all chose to be here. I presume most of you chose to be here. Maybe some of you were sentenced to this day of penury. But you're here engaged in this activity because you want to be. And what's important, among other things, about the ICF is that this notion of participation has become an extremely important goal, I think, for us to think about when we're working with children with disabilities. Because to the extent that they can be engaged in ways that are meaningful to them, life can be good. The other thing that's really important here is that there are contextual factors, and we have tended to forget the contextual factors. We've tended to look at the child and say, oh, this or that doesn't work, oh, we've got to try to fix it. But we've forgotten the self-evident notion that things happen in a context, an environmental context, which includes, as you'll see, human environment, attitudinal environment, political environment, all of which we take for granted but shouldn't. We should at least recognize. And there are also a fairly significant number of personal factors, the things that we want to do, the elements that we bring to a situation, which we have again tended classically to ignore when we're focusing on what's broken. Now, this is too big a group for a discussion, but I thought it's worth thinking about what you see, and maybe we'll just have people shout out a couple of ideas. What do you see about this picture that you think might be important? Sir?
The arrows go both ways.
The arrows go both ways. Yes. What else about the arrows? They're all connected. Thank you, Joanna. She's very good. The check is in the mail. Again, I won't belabor this, but the fact is that in the original notion that I told you about, we had the impairment causing problems of function, which we call disability, causing social handicap. And here you see that these are all interconnected, and I'm going to come back to this at the end. That the arrows go both ways, and that everything is important. So this is, to coin a phrase that is not original at all, a dynamic system. This is a system in which things can influence other things almost in any way. And again, this is very important because it gets us away from the notion that it starts here, we've got to do this to lead to that, and so on. The connections then hopefully make sense, and certainly I hope by 3:30 they'll make a lot more sense. And what I hope you will think about is how these ideas might be useful to you in your work tomorrow. So I want to talk about the F words and put them into the context of the ICF to illustrate how we can hang these ideas onto a framework like this, organize our thinking, and I hope there'll be some time for discussion and questions. So, the first F word is function. And some of you are rolling your eyes and saying, oh my God, is this what he came all the way from Canada to tell us? But I will tell you, in response to that skeptical question, that we have not always thought about things in this way. And what I've done is to situate the concept of function into activity, into doing things. So whether it's feeding or talking or mobility or brushing one's teeth or learning in school, these are activities that are all parts of our function. And the question that might be asked is this different from before? And I will argue very strenuously, yes, this is different from before, because we have traditionally focused on body structure and function. We assumed that we had to fix or improve the impairment. We had to work at this level because after all, this was where the problem was, and we had some lovely radiological evidence of that earlier this afternoon. If this is where the problem is, this is where we should be putting our energies. And to the extent that we can do that, we should do it. But we should not be seduced into thinking that this is the only thing that we have available to us and that this is where we must put all our energy. We also have traditionally assumed that as we worked on body structure and function at the body level, that activity would follow. And we have some pretty interesting evidence to show that you can make changes to body structure and function that are not associated with changes in function. So sadly, the equation doesn't work, often doesn't work. It may. Is it different from before? Now this is where I really get on my soapbox. Can I plead with everybody, never, ever again to use the N word. The word normal is a silly word. It doesn't apply in our business at all. Now, I'll throw that out as a major challenge and we can have some discussion about it. The reason I'm so strong about this is because we have traditionally assumed that as we helped kids to learn things through therapy and parenting and so on, that they had to do things normally, whatever that means. How many people here are left-handed? Hold up your left hands. You see that lady in green holds up her right hand. That's how acculturated. Okay, so, I mean, you're all abnormal because you represent only about 15% of the population. And that's not such a frivolous idea when you think that for a long time, children who were left-handed had their knuckles on their left hand wrapped. They had to use their right hand. I mean, how stupid is that in 2011? How many people wear glasses? I have to check. I mean, you know, how come we're okay, but if all the people wearing glasses were in wheelchairs, we'd say, whoa, what a weird audience. So I want to point out again how hypocritical we are, that it's okay to have an augmentation of one's vision, but we are confined to a wheelchair. I'm confined when I can't find my glasses because I have significant visual impairment. But with my glasses, I get along all right. I don't fly an airplane, but you know, I can manage pretty well. But if you think about just how arbitrary some of our thinking is about so-called normal, so-called abnormal, you realize why it's important to change our thinking. And I commented here that the ICF talks about building capacity, and it doesn't prescribe how things should be done. My capacity with my glasses is pretty reasonable. My capacity without my glasses is not so great. And the notion about capacity and performance is also important, and I'll give you an example or two to illustrate this. Capacity is what we do at our best. How many people are performing at their best most of the time? Thank you. Most of us are performing what we ordinarily do in our ordinary ways. We may rise to the occasion if we have to, as Joanna did this morning in giving a talk, even though she was very uncomfortable doing that. That was a magnificent performance at a level of capacity which she didn't know she had. But what we need to recognize is that performance improves with practice. And I was teasing Joanna about the fact that giving talks like this will be good practice for her defense of her PhD thesis. And by the time she's ready to defend her thesis, having given many more talks, she will be better at it. What's the relevance of this to kids with CP? The relevance is that performance improves with practice. And if we think about kids with disabilities like cerebral palsy, one of the ways to think about them is that they are deprived. I don't mean to insult any families here by assuming that you are neglecting your kids, but so much of what kids do is based upon doing it and doing it and doing it and doing it. And did I mention that they do it some more and then they practice some more and they practice some more? And kids with disabilities who have limited capacity may have significant limitations in the opportunity to practice. and to do things over and over and over. So to the extent that we can empower them to have experiences in whatever ways they can do things, we are helping them to realize some of the development of their capacity, which will improve their performance. And so encouraging function without regard to how nicely it is achieved is really important. So the emphasis here is on activity. This is consistent with development. Remember the D word. Kids with cerebral palsy are kids. They are developing. They are changing. They are learning. They are exploring. And to the extent that we can encourage that to happen, we are helping them to become as capable as they might want to be. We don't ever think about a 14-month or a 12-month-old, typically developing child, pulling up to standing at the furniture and cruising along, holding on. We don't think of that as abnormal motor function. But we think about a 2-year-old with diplegic cerebral palsy who's using a walker as doing things abnormally. Absolutely nonsensical. And there are still therapists, hopefully nobody in this room, who don't want children to use things like walkers because they'll become dependent on them. But how many toddlers became dependent on the furniture? Absolutely none. So why are we so restrictive, and why are we so strongly expecting that things have to be done in particular ways? Think about it. Think about development, typical development, as a guide to what we're trying to do and help kids to do, without thinking that they have to do it in a particular way. Many children, many typical children, crawl before they walk. But there are kids who don't ever crawl before they walk. There's no law of nature that says you have to crawl before you walk. There are kids who bum shuffle, who scoot around on the floor, and walk late. And they get up and walk and they won't stop. So that how things are done, in my view of the world, is much less important than that they are being done. And this moves us, as I say on the notes here, toward achievement and away from things being done normally. And by the way, there is, I think, some pretty important anecdotal evidence that we restrict children if we don't let them do things their own way. How many people here know what W-sitting is? How many people prescribe W-sitting? Okay, another reason, okay, one of us, two of us will will leave by the back door. I prescribe W-sitting for kids who can W-sit. W-sitting, for those who don't know, means sitting on your butt with your knees rotated in and your ankles out. So you're sitting between your ankles. And we have traditionally said, oh, don't let him do that. And because it's bad for his hips. It'll cause him to have internal rotation of his hips. And I say, you know what, he can do that because he has internal rotation of his hips. And by the way, I have no evidence, and I've never seen any evidence that this will be bad for his hips when he's 20. And by the way, when the child is sitting this way, they are comfortable, their hands are free, their back is straight, and they have two hands for play. And so trying to get them to side sit is an absolute waste of time. And I've said to parents, because I can see the child's can W-sit. Does she W-sit? Yes. Do you let her? And a slight bit of embarrassment. No, I say, what do you do? Do you try to stop her? Yes. Does it work? No. What do you do? And then the parent grudgingly admits that they let the child W-sit. And I said, that's fine. And I've had parents get up and come over and give me a hug. Because I've given them permission to let their child do something the child can do anyway that we can't stop. And it's a way of allowing kids to be adaptive and to get on with the playing and the development that's important to them. Okay, the second F word, again, self-evident, family. And family is the most important environment in which children grow up. The most important set of environmental influences are family. Why is this? Okay, so there's a family. I think this is the mom. I think this is the dad being protective and about to take on this police car. Or perhaps has called the police car to stop the traffic while they get on with their lives. Again, isn't this obvious? I would say yes and no. I say no because our traditional patient has been the child, and it's what I call the auto-mechanic approach to childhood disability. When my car doesn't work well, I take it to the shop, and in 2 or 3 hours it's working much better. Thank goodness for them. I don't mind paying all the money they want because they know how to get my car going. But, you know, this analogy really breaks down, because even though in this room are some of the world's best pediatricians, developmental therapists, and parents, the developmental therapists and the pediatricians don't really have that big a role. Now, again, that's a rude and provocative statement, which I hope will encourage even more discussion. But it is the parents, it is the environment in which this child lives that's important, not coming into the best auto body shop or the best auto mechanic shop. And our services have traditionally been very paternalistic. Now they're maternalistic because there are more women doctors than men doctors, but we haven't engaged well with families traditionally. We have said, thank goodness you've come to me, I'm a very smart, well-trained, whatever, and I'm going to give you advice, and you of course are going to take this advice. And we have missed huge opportunities to be helpful because we haven't thought about families. Self-evident. Parents are central to their children's lives. Parents' lives are complicated by virtue of having to deal with the likes of us. As nice as we are, as capable as we are, most families would prefer not to have to deal with us. And people have talked about the career of a carer. It's a very interesting idea. We all have professional careers, but most of us didn't choose to become a caregiver, parent, to a child with a disability. And so that complicates our lives in ways that are different from the typical demands on our lives with our typically developing kids. I mentioned, because it's one of my favorite themes, to remember that the parents with whom we deal are usually in the middle of a generational sandwich. When I meet a parent, I see them in the role of parent, and I forget that they're a fellow adult who probably has somebody waiting for them to get home from the consultation today, who's going to phone them and ask them what we said. And so understanding what other influences there are on the nuclear parent, the parent of the child we're seeing, is really important. We know a lot about parent health, and we've done a number of studies both with clinical populations and using population data. We know that the parental health, physical health and mental health, is often, significantly challenged relative to the health of comparable adults. That doesn't mean everybody's going to hell in a handcart. It doesn't mean everybody's falling apart, but it does mean that at the population level, families raising children with complicated lives have themselves got complicated lives, have themselves more risks of health, physical and mental health problems. And family-centered service is an approach that takes these issues into consideration. And we have, again, lots of evidence that this matters. So we've done a lot of work on family-centered service, and if you go to the CanChild website, CanChild, just C-A-N-C-H-I-L-D, just Google it, you'll find our website. As far as we know, it's the only use of that word in the English language. And family-centered service refers to engagement with parents as partners. It refers to treating parents with respect, something you would all take for granted and assume is happening, except it doesn't always happen. It implies continuity of care from time to time and person to person and system to system. It implies providing people with appropriate information relevant to their child. And the work that we've done, which we started in 1988, has the fingerprints of hundreds of families on it, because we did all this work with families as partners. We also know from work that we've done that's been replicated in the Netherlands and in Finland and in Sweden and in other countries, including the UK actually, that when services are perceived by parents to be more family-centered, they report more satisfaction with the likes of us. They report better mental health and they report less stress in dealing with people like us. The relevance of this, to answer my late father's question about why we need research for this, is that when the administrator of your particular clinical program says we're going to do a satisfaction survey, you can say to them, what we know from a lot of robust evidence that one of the ways to improve satisfaction is to be more family-centered. And they can say, what the hell are you talking about? And you can then answer them and tell them what the elements are of family-centeredness and how we can measure it. So this is the way of linking some of these ideas in this jigsaw puzzle that is the field that we're in. Another family, not sure if they're Canadian, but there it is. The third F word, fitness. A neglected aspect of childhood disability, one that is just beginning to be addressed by exercise scientists and others that we are trying to draw into our orbit. And here you see that we are actually interested in body structure and function. If one is relatively weak, if one is relatively undertrained in terms of the ordinary fitness levels of kids, that makes life more complicated. And there are lots of things that we can do to enhance the level of fitness of kids with disabilities. And it's an area to which we should put a great deal more attention than we have traditionally done. I'll let you look at this, and if you don't understand it, ask the person beside you. I didn't take this picture, but I think it is one of the most amazing pictures of nonsense that I've ever seen. One of the things about fitness, as I said, is that we know that kids with disabilities, including cerebral palsy, are less fit than they should be and less fit than their able-bodied age mates. And so we need to look at recreational opportunities, and work from Culver and company from the Sparkle study has shown that some of the differences that we see from one community to another are a function of things like social policies. And the work that was published, where's Alan? He's gone. Oh, there's Alan. When was the Fauconnier study? Two years ago? Yeah. I mean, a really important study that showed across 9 countries, I think, that there are really important differences in children's participation that correlate very strongly with social policies that have nothing specifically to do with kids with disabilities, that have to do with kids, that have to do with the way children are valued and treated and respected or less respected in different countries. And I'm only pointing this out to say that this isn't just the responsibility of professionals in this room, and it shouldn't just be the responsibility of parents to bang on doors. It should be a responsibility for all of us to value children more than we do. This kid clearly wasn't interested in today's talk. The fourth F word, fun. And fun involves participation, and fun involves personal factors. The point about fun is that that's what childhood should be about. It should be about discovery, and it should be about engagement in all sorts of ways. And I think we forget this. The ICF, as I said earlier, refers to participation as involvement in meaningful life situations. That's the ICF definition at the top. And there's a Ziggy cartoon which shows Ziggy climbing the mountain to the guru and saying, "Guru, what is the secret of life?" And the guru says, "Life is doing stuff." And that was 15 years ago when Dennis Harper, a friend of mine, brought this cartoon to a meeting that we were attending together. I think it's really an important notion. Engagement in life in things that are important to us, like today's meeting, is a really important part of what child development should be about. So the question becomes then, what can we do to enhance and increase participation of young people? Whether it's this kind of participation or whatever. Can we increase children's participation? Yes. How do we do that? Find out what they want to do. How many parents in this room have had their kids do piano lessons? How many of the kids have loved the piano lessons? How many of the kids who took piano lessons didn't love them? But we thought it was important. We didn't ask them what they wanted. And that's, again, just a frivolous example of something that we do as parents that we could probably do better if we found out what the kids were interested in. We can adapt activities. And I know that you folks know about adapted sports and recreation. Skiing for the disabled, horseback riding for the disabled. I mean, Joanna showed us a picture of her son on a horse and lots of other activities he was doing, actually. Now, I don't know whether he was riding the horse normally. I've been on a horse once and never want to get on a horse again. But the fact is that here was this nine-year-old, maybe was he 9 then?
No, he's about 7 now.
7, oh my God, even worse. A 7-year-old riding a horse. I mean, how incredible is that? That's an adapted activity that presumably is of value to him. And, you know, I think we can be much more imaginative. We don't have to worry about things being done normally. How many people here play tennis? How many people have played Roger Federer? I mean, why are you bothering to play tennis? If you're not going to challenge Roger Federer and Novak Djokovic, then you're wasting your time, right? Absolutely not. I rank among the top 30 or 40 million people in the world in tennis. Who gives a damn? I do it because it's fun. Why are we so strict about kids with disabilities? And I think we can clearly, by giving kids the opportunity to get engaged in things that are important to them, we can help them build their confidence, their competence, their sense of achievement, and their capacity. And most of them don't expect to be world beaters at whatever they're doing. The 5th F word, friends. Again, participation and personal factors. Finding people who have common interests. Somebody once said, profound comment, when you have an interest, other people take an interest in you. All of us can find people who have common interests with us. And to the extent that kids can build their interests, they can find people with similar interests and can have social networks and friends. And I don't mean social network in the modern sense. I mean there's that as well. Whatever tweeting and twitting and so on are. This is a BlackBerry-free zone here, so I don't know what all this stuff is. But the whole notion of developing oneself, one's sense of self, one's sense of personhood, I think is hugely important. And the quality of friendships is important, the quality of relationships, rather than having lots and lots of friends. It's nice to have lots of friends, but having friends that are meaningful to oneself is really what it's about. And I think there's a lot that we can do, and we can encourage families to do, to empower, enhance children's opportunities. I always ask parents, or ask the kids actually, have you been to a birthday party lately? Whose birthday party did you go to? Who's coming to your party? And I want to know whether they can name 2 or 3 kids who are coming to their party. I don't care if it's a cousin. I do care if it's a gratuitous kind of emptiness. But if they can name people that are important to them, that are part of their orbit, that tells me something about their lives, which I think is really important. And again, I think this is a fundamental part of kids' lives that is too easy to forget when we're focusing on the limbs that don't work and on the hand function that isn't beautiful and so on. And I'm not saying to ignore those things. Again, I want to emphasize, I'm not suggesting we ignore those things. I'm suggesting that we try to put into context the things that we're recommending in our therapeutic interventions, into the context of these F words. Another example of friendship, not a frivolous one. I think it's very useful to have 4-legged friends as well as 2-legged friends. So here's how I think we can hang these F words together. I think they all fit into the ICF. The fitness, the function, the friendships, and so on all have a place in this framework. And what I'm hoping is that people will be able to take away, and I'll tell you where you can get a hold of this stuff in a minute, that people will take away these ideas and see that they can be part of how we think, how we talk with families, how we organize, conceptualize, and deliver our advice and our services. Now, here's where I think the comment is Mary, you're Mary, yeah, that Mary made earlier about the interconnection of these ideas. And that is, let's imagine that we can enhance a child's engagement in some activity that's meaningful to them. That engagement might in turn lead to changes in their capacity. And changes in that capacity or that activity might lead to changes in body structure and function. And you see that this is kind of going backwards from the traditional, let's fix the body parts so that the function will be better, so the participation will be better. And it's simply giving us permission to see the interconnectedness of these ideas and the possibility of intervening at any of these points without being stuck in the traditional notion of the hierarchy that we have to start here in order to fix this so that this will help that. And there is evidence to support these kinds of interconnections. Very different from the traditional biomedical thinking, which had us trying to fix things so that the function would be normal, so that they could get on with their lives. The sixth and final F word is future. And I think we need to start talking about the future almost from the beginning. And I say almost because, as we were talking at lunch, some of our conversations in the early days with families are very much about what this is, what it means, and what can we do about it. But I don't think we should wait until kids are 15 and 16 before we start talking about the future. I think we need to think about the future right from the beginning, because this is what child development is about. Development is about becoming. It is being in the moment, but it is also forward-looking. And I think we need to talk about this with families right from the outset. And as I said earlier, put our ideas, our interventions, our therapies into a context of what does this mean to the child's overall development as a person. Not just how beautifully they walk or how beautifully they use their hemiplegic limb. Those are important, but they shouldn't be the end goals in my view. And this involves also thinking about transition to adulthood. And thinking about this at an early phase of our engagement with families. Let me remind us that when we start working with families of children with cerebral palsy or most neurodisabilities, our relationship is with the parents. Very important. Essential, in fact. No 6-month-old comes in and says, I'm worried that I might be developing cerebral palsy because I was a prem baby and I think I had PBL. Parents come in. That's how our relationship starts. What we have to work towards is starting from an early age to engage the child. Not to make serious decisions, but to remember that the child, in the course of their becoming, becomes an individual with whom we should also have a relationship. So that when the child is whatever age you choose, 8, 10, 12, we start off our conversation with them and ask them about things and ask their permission to talk to the parents about the things that they're concerned about. So that when the children get into early adolescence, we're seeing them on their own first. We're finding out about their lives. We're giving them the kind of independence they wouldn't ordinarily need to be given if they were a typically developing child. Now, I like to say that parenting is a dance led by the children. And anybody who's raised a typical 2-year-old can imagine what I mean. Many children with disabilities aren't terribly good dancers. And if they're not leading the dance, it's much harder for parents to parent. And if a child has always been the person who is dressed and fed by other people, they're not going to say one day, oh, I can do it myself. They may. But unless we consciously think about that, unless we're consciously thinking about the next phases of their development, we are missing opportunities to encourage, and promote the child's independence. So I strongly encourage people to think about this. Right. So I think that's as much as I want to say to provoke you into questions and discussion. I'm happy to open this up for discussion. And by the way, is that when I had finished doing this talk and gotten some help from Jan Willem, my friend and colleague in the next office, I said, we ought to write this up. And he said, that's a good idea. So we sat down one afternoon and wrote this into a paper and sent it to Child Care, Health and Development. And a week later they said, we love it, it's in press. So this paper will be coming out soon with all of these ideas without the pictures, except the ICF pictures. So for those of you who are interested in following it up, it'll be out in the next few months. And that's why I didn't have a handout today. So let's open up for questions and discussion. That is not me. But again, what I love about this picture is look how pissed off the kid is. He's peed on his dad and he's annoyed. Or maybe he's annoyed at the photographer. Questions, comments, discussion, please. Flatter me by responding, reacting. Yeah.
It's a wonderful talk. I'm sure many of the people sitting here, many of the people here do subscribe to your views. Because having moved around the region, I have felt that most of the people who work in this region do subscribe to these views. I can assure you that. But just a quick question related to the website that you mentioned about CanChild. Sometime the last 1 year, I've been trying to access the website. There was some reason mentioned that it's closing down, or
no. What we've said. This is not a paid political announcement. I did not ask him to say this, but CanChild for 20 years was funded by the province of Ontario, by the research branch of the Ministry of Health, and 2 years ago they stopped our funding. And so we are selling pencils and washing cars and doing other things to kind of keep ourselves going. So there's a note on the website that says you should know this, and if you're a rich billionaire who wants to be nice to us, we'll welcome your involvement. But there's still no fee for using the website.
Thank you. It's a wonderful website.
Yeah. Thank you. The fact that let me ask you a question, because this is a very nice comment, and I appreciate the compliment, and I appreciate that this is maybe Coles to almost Newcastle. That was good. Come on. But if these ideas are so sensible, how come we're not doing them? Yeah.
I think in certain areas we are. I mean, I'm a conductor teacher at a local school, and conductor education has always been about finding individual solutions for each child.
Yeah.
They might not look pretty, they might not be in supportive seating all the time, but they are the child's way of doing things, and we aim for all the function, we don't aim for normality. And those ideas really fit into what you say, so
Yeah.
that's what we're striving for as well.
But would you agree that this isn't happening everywhere?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so the question is, why isn't it happening everywhere if these ideas are so sensible? Oh, we've got two people who are going to tell us. Okay, lady in front first. She had her hand up first.
Thank you very much, and it was really inspiring talk, and I hope it's how my model of care of a paediatrician is wanting, and I desperately strive for. The challenge that I think we have currently is that I run very specialist clinics and very functional activities, and I am looking at body structure and function, but I'm trying to do it in a kind of a way in which I'm trying to think about the long-term quality of life for people, and young people with cerebral palsy. The challenge I have is I work in a resource-based NHS where people are asking me for very objective evidence and very objective outcome measures of the treatment I do. And I'm not sure we have good outcome evidence for a lot of the interventions that we do in health, paediatrics and in child development. And therefore, when I'm trying to get, I gave a talk recently about research and practice in our upper limb clinic, and I had one of the very senior consultants from hospital management come down directly afterwards and say, lovely talk, think it's a wonderful thing that you're doing, but why should
No,
I fund
I think
that?
it's a wonderful thing you're doing, dear.
Yeah. Why should I fund that as a healthcare commissioner? And this is social care and education care and family care rather than health. And I think this is the big challenge we have in the UK and in the region and across the world probably.
Yeah, the short answer is that we're bedeviled by the randomized clinical trial approach to showing that this works better than that over 6 months to manage blood pressure or depressive symptoms or something. And most of what we're talking about has a different time course and different kinds of outcomes. So I have absolutely no argument with what you're saying. I think we need to continue, first of all, collaboratively, as people in our field do, people in our fields do, to bring the bits of evidence together. I think we have to show the administration that we're talking not about a hemiplegic limb that can now grasp, 14 seconds worth of things that used to take 18 seconds, but that the unit of interest is the family, that family well-being and family satisfaction are important, that children's engagement in life is important, and to continue to show pieces of evidence. I like to think of this, I used the analogy, the metaphor earlier of a jigsaw puzzle. I think we have an incredibly complex jigsaw, and sadly we don't have the picture on the top of the box to know what it's going to look like. But to the extent that we can connect pieces with one another, that's the kind of evidence. There isn't an easy answer. But it has to do with what we do. If you've got half an hour with a family, what do you do? If you've got half an hour as a therapist, what do you do? Besides, screaming that we need another half hour. Lady in the back. Oh. Sorry, I thought you were going to make a comment. Microphone. Okay.
I think one of the things we're becoming aware of from where we come from, and coming to this conference, is in this room we've got an awful lot of medical people, teachers, that side of things. But one part of the equation that's sadly lacking, and it's lacking in parents' lives, is local authority, is governmental input. All these people in the room are working with this subject on a day-to-day basis, and they have little or no influence on global policies. And so all these people working under the influence of the government and the local authority, especially in education, how do you see the influences of this talk being subjected or brought to the attention of the power brokers?
I suppose seeking opportunities to meet with them to share some of these ideas, at least as a first approximation, because to the extent that they represent the people in the community at large, they probably have some of what I will call arrogantly the old-fashioned ideas. And that if we're not fixing the kids, why are we wasting our time? The point that this lady made a minute ago. And being able to share these ideas, not on the bully pulpit and not on a soapbox, but to say, here are some new ways of thinking about things. And here's, for example, where environment fits in, where school, the nature of the educational experience is very important, where we don't have to have kids doing things normally, where there are opportunities to engage kids, where we can, you policymakers can open up the programs to children with disabilities and functional limitations, as well as to typically developing children. I think we can inform, I was going to say educate, but that's too arrogant. I think we can inform them about these ways of thinking, and that there is evidence, for example, from Alan's work, that this actually matters across Europe, across the community. Those are the kinds of things we can do, rather than, I ran out of righteous indignation a long time ago. I used to have a hell of a lot of it, and it didn't get me anywhere, and it didn't get anybody else anywhere. But I think sharing these ideas and saying, we have traditionally thought about things in this way. Here's some new ways about thinking about things. And when they say, yes, but what about the liability? You say, this issue's been addressed in these and these and these sectors. What about how we run these programs? Well, let's engage with families. because they may have ideas. I think it's a process of discussion. There isn't an easy answer. If there were, somebody would have done it by now.
Hi. In answer to your original question of why aren't we, moving forward with this, I feel that sometimes, like you giving the parent the permission to actually carry out therapy in that way or to sit in a certain way, it's almost that we sometimes need, from a medical background, permission to change practice and to do things very differently.
Yep.
Because we are coming from a medical background.
Yeah, well, that was the answer I was actually hoping you'd say.
I wanted to see the child first and the condition second.
We all bring with us the training, the baggage, the ideas, the attitudes that we were trained with. And the problem with changing the whole system is that if we could blank out everybody's memory and just, put in the new ideas, we'd all do them. Until next year when somebody came out with better ideas and we'd be stuck in this year's version of things. But in the community at large, and I clearly am not talking to the converted, people who are here today are here because they want to be and are already thinking about these things. But out in the community, in the education community, in the therapy community, in the medical community, sadly, there's still a lot of old ideas. That's why I said deer. Because, that's a I used to get patted on the head and said, there's a good boy. Now go back to your cage and do your thing. We have to have big egos. We have to have patience. We have to have persistence. And we have to try to inform without getting as angry as I used to do by saying, here's some new ways of doing things. And by the way, there's some evidence to support this. For example, the study that Marjolein Ketelaar did 10 years ago, a physical therapist colleague in the Netherlands, did a study in which she looked with a randomized clinical trial, actually a very good one, in which she looked at therapist-directed physical therapy provided by therapists addressing the goals they identified for 2 to 6-year-olds with cerebral palsy, compared with physical therapists addressing the goals that the parents or the children identified. And what she showed was the outcomes were as good in both groups. And what's the punchline? Much less therapy in the parent-directed goal approach. So that instead of, if we try to fix things, we'll end up with an endless amount of therapy because we'll never fix it. And we'll be disappointed. If we change the ways in which we try to address goals, particularly the goals that parents identify, like helping kids to dress on their own, perhaps by adapting their clothing, helping the kids to feed on their own, even if it's messy. Those kinds of things, I think, are the things over which we have immediate control. And when when the boss says, "Why are you doing that?" we can give them a decent answer, and we can show them the parents are more satisfied with what we're doing. We can also do, as Lindsay said this morning, we can do blocks of intensive intervention over a short period of time to try to move kids up a notch in whatever aspect of functioning we're talking about, and then see whether they maintain that. And on the assumption they maintain that, we can then say, all right, what's the next thing you want to work on when you're ready?
I'm a paediatric physiotherapist, and I'm quite challenged by your comment about W-sitting.
I knew you would be. I always get at least one vocal person. Go ahead.
And I don't disagree with rejoicing in the fact that a child is able to sit independently and reach out. And I wouldn't necessarily stop a child doing that, but I wouldn't encourage lots of practice of doing something like that or lots of crawling as if I were able to, as a therapist, encourage a child to maybe sit on a little bench or to use some sort of walking aid that would bring them up so they can still explore, I would suppose use my skills to encourage them on what's the next stage, because I don't want them to develop flexion and contraction of their hips and knees. And I know that's very medical and looking at their joints, but it's also thinking, what do I want them to achieve, or what do they want to achieve in the future? And if they do want to be able to be up and explore, then I need to think about their hips and knees.
Yep.
Rather than think, well, I don't care how you do this, you can pull and pull with your arms, and then when you get to 20, if you can't reach your arms out, you're in trouble. You know, I think I do need to think ahead, because I've got that knowledge and expertise, which parents don't necessarily have until they get there, until it's too late. So I suppose I feel I have to use my experience and my knowledge of function and how children could potentially end up if they're not given the right advice.
Yeah, I mean, part of the question is, do we have evidence that they're going to end up badly? And
Well,
the answer is no.
Yeah. What I tend to do with parents is I say, well, for example, if they're having to, if you're walking a child by them pulling with their arms, then their arms might feel really stiff afterwards. If you walk them, supporting them from behind, their arms might stay nice and loose.
Yeah.
And I just say, just feel for yourself, when do they feel loose? When are they able to use their arms after? And just find out for yourself what works.
Yeah, no, I have no trouble with that. And by the way, I don't limit kids to W sitting. I use W sitting as my provocation to get this kind of discussion going. But I'm simply saying that the idea of trying to stop kids from doing things that are adaptive is a mug's game.
Yeah.
I don't disagree with what you said. Martin.
Peter, thank you very much. I just wanted to raise a couple of points in two completely different directions. The first is P-words. And this comes down to this point that was being discussed before about evidence. There are some things that actually don't need evidence, like pain relief. Pain relief is right because it's right, because it's right. It is fundamental to the role of every therapist born that we try to relieve suffering. And I'd say that participation comes into the same category. That participation is a fundamental fact of humanity. And we don't have to justify participation on the basis of any trials, anywhere, anytime. And therefore the things that enhance participation need to be responded to robustly. And people who go around smugly demanding evidence that they know can never be produced, around something that is fundamentally important, need to be told where to get off and to alter their thinking, not that we should go away with our tail between our legs thinking, well, I can't produce that kind of evidence, therefore I'm not going to make any difference in this conversation. So that's my first thing. And
my comment would be, those are the people that should be in the control group on the randomized trial of parachutes.
Yes, absolutely.
That's not original, by the way. There was a letter in the BMJ or Lancet some years ago that made this point that not everything, exactly what Martin's saying, not everything had to be proved with RCTs.
So I think that's one very important place when we're having these discussions with commissioners and those who would purchase things. And the second point is, if I could just ask, how many people in this room are really good at reading all the stuff that comes out of the Department of Health? I thought so. And the point I'm making here is that actually over the last 15 to 20 years, we have been bombarded with stuff that totally talks the talk in the way that you just have done. The problem is that when it comes in a 50-page management speak Department of Health document, it either gets trashed as a PDF into the recycle, or it goes into the small round filing cabinet on the floor. And the fact of the matter is that policymakers right up at the top, although we may not like to think so, have actually been trying to promote this stuff. Mm-hmm. So there's a double question here. We all agree that it's important, but it doesn't happen as much as it should. And even central government thinks it's important, and it still doesn't happen as it should. So what then is the problem? And the problem is that in a very complex series of systems that are meant to be supporting children with disability in general, and children with cerebral palsy in particular,
Thank you. The only comment I would add to that is that I think we can have a fifth column, which in fact is the first column, and that's parents. And to the extent that these ideas become part of what parents expect, they will become our particularly strong advocates. I don't mean to put yet another burden onto parents who already have complicated lives, but